Welcome to Save Us From Hell, a podcast about the United Nations. I'm Mark Leon Goldberg, an international affairs journalist, editor-in-chief of UN Dispatch, and I run Global Dispatches. And To Save Us From Hell is a project of Global Dispatches.
I'm Anjali Dayal. I'm an associate professor of international relations at Fordham University in New York, and I teach and research and write about the UN.
So on June 30th, about 30 representatives from governments around the world and from international institutions are meeting in Doha, Qatar, as part of a process convened under the auspices of the United Nations to find a way to engage with the de facto authorities in Afghanistan, otherwise known as the Taliban. Now, this particular meeting is the third iteration of what's known as the Doha process. The first iteration of that happened about a year ago and deliberately excluded the Taliban. It was just a way to get the international players kind of on the same page and how they might, read from the same playbook when engaging with the Taliban. In the second iteration of that, it's kind of unclear whether the Taliban were invited or declined to attend. In any case, they did not attend. This time around, on June 30th, they were deliberately and explicitly invited to attend following a meeting in Kabul between Rosemary DiCarlo, the Undersecretary General for Political and Peace-Building Affairs, a very senior UN official. And now everyone's meeting in Doha starting June 30th. And this has created a degree of controversy for the fact that there are no Afghan women participating in this meeting between these 30-odd international representatives on the one hand and the Taliban on the other. Anjali, help us make sense of what's going on.
Yeah, something to note up top is that under political pressure, they've announced that Undersecretary DiCarlo and others will meet with Afghan civil society members, including women, the day after the main process concludes. It's important to note that this is not what women's groups are asking for, though. It is not what Afghan women are asking for. What they are asking for is to be included as part of the key political process. And they're being actively excluded. This comes on the heels of, last year, the independent panel of experts examining the human rights situation in Afghanistan called the situation on the ground there akin to gender apartheid, right? Since the Taliban assumed authority again in 2021, we've seen a crackdown on women's ability to function in public spaces, to work outside the home, to work for NGOs or other international bodies, places where women had been sort of able to be active over the previous decade and change.
And go to school after the age of 11.
Right? Critically, right? And so we are seeing across Afghanistan the sort of closing in on women's ability to be public, free, active individuals who are able to shape their own lives. And so the exclusion of women from a fundamental political process of engagement is happening in that context. And it's happening against the express wishes of Afghan women. And it's coming on the heels of, last year, the Taliban submitted this curious CEDAW report on the progress of women around Afghanistan.
And CEDAW is a convention on the elimination of discrimination against women. It's like the main UN human rights platform to address discrimination against women, of which the Taliban are very, very skilled.
That's right. It is every couple of years, every state party has to submit a report on its progress toward meeting its obligations under international law towards women. Now, human rights in general, but women's rights in particular, rest on a really weak set of instruments and really weak set of protections. All of these rights depend on a state's ability to uphold them. And in that context, it was a little bit farcical for the Taliban to submit a report saying how it was attempting to meet its obligations under international law towards women. But one way to actually look at that ploy is to think of it as being a way to try and legitimize itself, right? And try and basically say, look, we are good international citizens as part of a sort of campaign towards legitimizing themselves or to being accepted as legitimate political actors. They are making a sort of show of trying to accept their obligations under international law, even though the content of what they were submitting to CEDAW was absolutely farcical, right?
Mhm.
Was proposing a vision of women's rights that really bears no resemblance to what we would expect full scale women's rights to be. And, this is the kind of thing where the Taliban doesn't need UN human rights experts to say, we think the Taliban is doing a terrific job. They
Mhm.
just need other states to say, look, they're trying, right?
Mm.
They just need other states to give them political cover to proceed with this plan.
So, do you see this meeting in Doha,
Mhm.
therefore, as an extension of the Taliban's sort of desire to be seen internationally as the legitimate government of Afghanistan? Look, they are the de facto government of
Yeah.
Afghanistan. They're the people you need to deal with if you're the United Nations and you need to say, deliver food aid throughout
Mhm.
Afghanistan. You need to work with the Taliban. They are the de facto authorities. But you are potentially arguing, and tell me if I'm wrong,
Mhm.
that from the Taliban's perspective, it's great to be sitting across the table from Rosemary DiCarlo, because
Yeah.
that means that, you are perceived as the legitimate representatives of the Afghan people.
That's right. In some sense, this is tricky, right? Because it is the case that Afghan women's groups also have argued that, not engaging with the Taliban is not an option for international actors. They have to engage with the Taliban. It is the only way for the international aid and assistance that Afghan women need to enter the country, particularly in the face of desperate humanitarian conditions for the average citizen of Afghanistan, right? But the double-edged sword here, right, is that, it is basically what the Afghan scholar Orzala Nemat has called a strategy of normalizing misogyny, right? The outreach efforts have been a way for the Taliban to normalize their misogyny as they seek diplomatic engagement that the international community has to give them in order to get aid and assistance into the Afghan people.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this just underscores a very kind of delicate position that the United Nations is in vis-a-vis Afghanistan. Right? On the one hand, you saw, Human Rights Watch
Mhm.
very, forcefully blasted the idea that the UN and other international entities would be meeting with the Taliban absent any Afghan women present. Um, and I get that. They're Human Rights Watch.
Mhm.
They have exclusively to focus on human rights. The UN has a lot more in its portfolio than human rights. I mean, it includes human rights, but it also includes humanitarian assistance. It includes development assistance. It includes counter narcotics. There's like a lot that the UN and other international actors have to deal with regarding Afghanistan. And so there is, I think, a degree of pragmatism that's potentially warranted when having to, deal with the de facto authorities here. And I think it's also not insignificant that the UN official in charge of these talks is a woman. Also, a woman is the head of the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. She's a diplomat from Kyrgyzstan. So I think that's like not to be discounted either.
It's not to be discounted, but I think it's important to note that neither one of those women is Afghan.
Of
And
course.
traditionally, since the early 2000s, the instrumentalization of Afghan women, right? The use of them as a symbol, the use of them as a sort of political cover for invasion and for imperialist projects has been a key feature of the West's engagement with Afghanistan. But Afghan women have been very clear that nothing about them should happen without them, right? That they are
Mhm.
political actors, that they are people with voices, and the presence of any woman in the room does not substitute for the presence of an Afghan woman in the room. And I think there are a couple of ways for us to look at that, right? Speaking of Human Rights Watch, last year, one of their Afghanistan experts, Sahir Fetrat, put out this sort of uh, key set of points about principled engagement with the Taliban, right? So, not that international actors shouldn't interact with the Taliban, but they should do so in a way that's principled and that insists on the value of women's rights, that insists that Afghan women are involved in any discussions with international actors, right, about the future of Afghanistan, and by striving to provide the key aid and advocacy and support that Afghan women need. And in that context, we always have this traditional discussion at the UN about the trade off between immediate political expediency and long term political inclusion. And even though um, this is like a maximum value on political repression, right? When we think about the Taliban's treatment of Afghan women, it exists on the same continuum of how do we balance rights and security, or how do we balance rights with pragmatic engagement. And in that sense, a way for us to think about this is, you know, the kind of engagement that you're going to get from the Taliban over the long term that actively excludes significant parts of the population is unlikely to produce long term stability and success. And in that context, we have a ton of research that shows us that more inclusive political bargains are more likely to last, right? That inclusive sorts of dialogues that include all of the sort of affected members of society are more likely to endure. And so there's an expedient reason to do it also. The other thing is to note that expediency is not the only thing. So even though, as you say, the UN has all of these different things that it's trying to do simultaneously, the idea that it could do so by saying we're okay with excluding Afghan women from this debate has all kinds of downstream consequences, including, undermining the core principles of Security Council Resolution 1325, which essentially says that women have to be key parts of processes like these. So, it sets a bad precedent for other kinds of inclusions down the road. That doesn't mean the solution is necessarily easy, right? But it does mean that it's unlikely to produce the kind of inclusive political outcome they want if they're going to say, we'll meet with the Taliban days 1 through 3, and we'll meet you after they've left on day 4 and see what you have to say, right? We could even imagine a world in which they had flipped those things, right? And said, look, we're going to meet with civil society and Afghan women first and make sure that even if the Taliban refuses to meet with them, we are bringing their concerns that they've given us to the table, right? I don't know if that would necessarily be what Afghan women wanted, but we can imagine a world in which that would be at least a sort of more free-flowing dialogue from civil society to high politics.
So one thing also that this episode, I think, illustrates to me is how awkward it is for the United Nations when the de facto rulers of a country are not the ones that are represented at the United Nations itself. Like, who these days is representing Afghanistan in the halls of UN headquarters? I mean, it's not the Taliban.
No, it's the representative of the pre-Taliban government who has just continued to be seated after the fall of that government. It is, something to the extent that anything about the situation is funny, right? This is almost like a Peter Sellers style comedy, right? Where there's like this one guy representing a government that doesn't exist anymore who sits at the UN because the UN doesn't want to be in the position of having to recognize the other government. So this guy shows up by himself,
Votes in the General Assembly, like he has
Yeah.
all the rights afforded to him as the legitimate representative of Afghanistan. But he doesn't represent Afghanistan in any sort of like de facto manner.
Yeah, in sort of like academic speak, we talk about the difference between juridical and empirical statehood, right? So in law, Afghanistan exists as one thing, and on the ground, Afghanistan exists as another thing. And so Afghanistan is running around, in law as one set of understandings of, stateness. And it's running around the world as another set of understandings of stateness. And for an organization like the UN, um, That's obviously like politically tricky to resolve, but it's also kind of funny at the end of the day. Like it is, there's a lot of comic potential in that situation.
Armando Iannucci, if you are listening, this one's for you.
Yeah. I think it is worth noting, at least putting on the table, that there's good reason to believe a lot of governments around the world are comfortable shoving women's rights obligations into a closet, right? Like, even though the Taliban has an extreme position on women's rights, CEDAW is not a particularly strong body of international law for a reason, right? It is widely adopted, and 189 countries have signed on to it. Only, I think, two have not ratified. Of course, the U.S. is one of them. And at the end of the day, if you actually go and look at the ratifications, most countries have crossed out a ton of provisions because they don't believe they're bound to the body of law, right? And so the treatment of women, it's an easy political commitment to toss out the window when there are other political expediencies on the line. And countries are willing to do that over and over and over again. And so that we see it here isn't surprising. What is concerning is the absolute like terror of the position that Afghan women find themselves in. And so even though we shouldn't be surprised by the willingness to give up on the commitment to women's rights, we should be uniquely concerned about it in a situation that the UN itself has described as akin to gender apartheid.